Hi, I'm Rebecca Balcarzel. Let's take a walk through Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, The Poet. It's going to take several videos, but it'll be so worth it. He starts out talking about people who are not true poets. He says those who are esteemed umpires of taste, all right, so the folks who declare themselves critics and reviewers, they are not the true poets, and they don't understand the real creative spark or the origin of creativity. He says that these people have some limited judgment of color or form, which is exercised for amusement or for show. So they show off trying to critique other people's work and stuff, but they don't have a deep understanding. He says that these people have lost the perception of the instant dependence of form upon soul. Okay, this is an interesting idea. It's almost a New Agey idea, but of course he lives at a time around the Civil War era. He says that there's an instant dependence of form on soul. So the outward forms are actually products of a soul. For Emerson, form and soul are not just linked, but soul causes form. Soul inspires form to come into being. Let me read further. He says that the people who don't understand creativity say we were put into our bodies as fire is put into a pan to be carried about. So those folks, not the true poet, they think the body is just some kind of vessel, some sort of container, and the soul is inside of it. Emerson doesn't think so. Emerson says we are not pans and barrows, nor even porters of the fire and torch bearers, but children of the fire, made of it. So for Emerson, the body is part of the soul. It's an expression of the soul. It itself comes out of the soul. And this is something that the average person doesn't understand, but that the poet apprehends. He says the highest minds of the world have never ceased to explore the double meaning or even manifold meaning of every sensuous fact. And then he lists a bunch of these highest minds, including Plato and Dante. So these highest minds see the sensuous fact, meaning anything that the senses can see, hear, touch. So you take a chair, okay, that's a sensuous fact. And he says that the highest minds can see the true meaning, and not just one meaning, but many meanings, manifold meanings in that object, in any kind of fact that the senses can perceive. So the whole universe becomes a giant sort of a symbol for true meaning, an expression of real meaning. So a tree is not just the tree, but the highest mind sees it as something more. I'm going to imagine maybe they see growth and branching as universal truths, rooting, stretching to the sky, stretching upward. Maybe these are some of the meanings that a plain old tree would reveal to the true poet, that the true poet would see these kinds of things. I'm not claiming to be the true poet, so I'm just creating an example, but this is what he's trying to say, that any sensuous fact has some kind of manifold meaning that the great minds, the highest minds, he says, are able to see. So there's special poet vision that he's talking about. Next point. The poet stands among partial men for the complete man. So in some way, non-poet folks are incomplete. They're partial. And the poet is somehow a symbol of wholeness, or is whole, and has this completeness. And the poet apprises us not of his wealth, but of the commonwealth. So the poet doesn't talk just about private insights and experiences, but is able to comment on universal truths, on the human condition, on the big stuff, and talk about the big questions that underlie our human experience, our human project on this world. So the poet is able to talk about the commonwealth and not just private concerns. Now, the poet may use the private as a symbol of the larger, so that the poet says, well, I've had this experience, but it has larger ramifications. My experience reveals universals that everyone relates to. And Emerson's going to get to that too. He says that the poet may be isolated among men. So the poet may remove himself to introspect, or herself, to introspect, to ponder, to delve into these deeper meanings. And it could be lonely, but then Emerson says that doing that, the poet actually will draw all men sooner or later. So Emerson says this is his or her consolation, that even though one must remove oneself in order to reflect and think deeply, once you express these universal truths, it draws people to you. It pulls people toward you, because everybody hungers for those truths. In fact, he says, for all men live by truth and stand in need of expression. Everyone needs that expression. And so when they find it, and they find the poet doing the expressing, they want to be part of it. They want to come closer to the poet. So even though the poet isolates him or herself, people will draw toward the poet eventually. Next part. Emerson says, I know not how it is that we need an interpreter, but the great majority of men seem to be minors who have not yet come into possession of their own. So he's saying, I'm not sure why we need an interpreter, but we do. We need the poet to interpret life to us. He says that most men seem to not be in possession of their own. So they live a life, but they don't seem to be in full possession of it. They don't understand it still. And the poet offers that understanding. He says these minors cannot report the conversation they have had with nature. So the average person can't explain their experience of life, the conversation they've had with nature. So not only trees and sky, sunsets, but even the human nature. It's hard to report what the true experience was and to go deep into saying something honest and real about life. Most people aren't doing that, but the poet does, and we need that person. Emerson says that person's an interpreter that we do need. All right, next part. He says the poet is the person in whom these powers are in balance, the man without impediment who sees and handles that which others dream of, traverses the whole scale of experience, and is representative of man, in virtue of being the largest power to receive and to impart. So the poet is able to see without impediment, so without baggage, without, cloudy vision. The poet sees clearly, perceives truly, and then is representative of man, becomes the representative of all humans, because he's able to receive fully. It says that he has the largest power to receive. So he can intake more than the average person, and without those impediments. And impart means to then talk about it and give from that experience. So the poet can receive and can give and is complete in that way. Now we get to an interesting section. Emerson says that the universe has three parts. He says the universe has three children born at one time, which reappear under different names in every system of thought, whether they be called cause, operation, and effect, those are the three, or more poetically, Jove, Pluto, Neptune, or theologically, the Father, the Spirit, and the Son, but which we will call here the knower, the doer, and the sayer. Wow, okay, so he sees these three elements. I've also heard the same group of three called the causal, the astral, and the physical. But whatever you call them, he sees that the universe has these three children, he says. These stand respectively for the love of truth, the love of good, and the love of beauty. These three are equal. So for Emerson, the universe has some kind of plane of existence that's all ideas. This is the Father, this is the cause, the knower. And then a little more manifested, like starting to become the mechanism by which manifestation will come. We need spirit or astral, or he says the doer. There's a some kind of mechanism that starts to make an idea into a thought. And then the last stage is fully manifested. The sayer, who can actually say the idea out loud in words, or the son, who exists as a human example of the Father, or you could say the physical, that brings that causal idea all the way into manifestation so that humans can interpret and see it and experience it. Emerson says that the poet is able to be in touch with that source, that inexhaustible plane of pure idea, unformed energy, that's, or maybe even before energy, that some kind of existence like that is part of the universe. It reminds me of Plato and his ideal forms. So for Emerson, there's that area, and then there's the second spirit area, and then there's physical, the sun, or all these different names for it, the cause all the way to the effect. And the effect, the sayer, is the poet who can say this idea that's come all this way. Okay, now Emerson also says something quite radical. I think it's very interesting. Beauty is the creator of the universe. Okay, how can that be? But for Emerson, if beauty is this idea, organizing principle of the universe, then it's beauty that gets manifested in nature, in people, even in mathematical equations, proportion, and so on. So beauty creates the universe. Wow. Cool. All right. And this also reminds me of Keats, the poet, British poet, a romantic poet, who said in one of his poems, Ode on a Grecian Urn, beauty is truth and truth is beauty. So for Emerson, that's really the case. It's not just a pretty idea. For Emerson, truth and beauty are one and the same, and they create the universe. It's very interesting to think this way. All right, moving on. The poet does not wait for the hero or the sage, as they act and think primarily. So he writes primarily what will and must be spoken. So the poet says what needs saying. The hero does action that needs doing. The sage does thinking that needs thinking. But the poet is writing or speaking the truths of life. And Emerson says, for poetry was all written before time was. And whenever we are so finely organized that we can penetrate into that region where the air is music, we hear those primal warblings and attempt to write them down. Okay, so now he's saying that that realm, that idea realm, are primal warblings. And this is what the poet is able to hear or to write down, and that all of us occasionally might be able to ascend into that place where the air is music, he said. And poetry was written before anything was. So again, we're talking about some kind of realm in which poems are not words yet, but he sees poetry as coming from that causal realm, that idea realm. But Emerson says that when we attempt to write them down, we lose ever and anon a word or a verse and substitute something of our own, and thus miswrite the poem. So the true poem often doesn't get produced, because the true poem, when it gets into words, people who are writing them down insert their own little ego stuff, and they mishear the true spirit of the poem, and so they write down something a little imperfect. But a perfect poem would be able to say or elucidate, to put into words, the perfectly pure idea. Now he says that words and deeds are quite indifferent modes of the divine energy. Words are also actions, and actions are a kind of words. So the divine energy comes through in deeds, in actions, but also in words. So words carry the divine energy. So poets, if they are wielding words, deploying words, then they're putting out the divine energy. And maybe we all are as we speak and as we write. All right, we're going to stop there and pick it up in video 2.